percent of the land mass covered by temperate rainforest in the world? This is worldwide, not just in British Columbia. What percent of the land mass is covered by temperate rainforest? Anybody know? Okay, I heard 8. Oh, A, okay. All of you who said A get to stay after and clean the erasers with me. You're the top students. It's exactly that. So 0.2%. So that means that temperate rainforests have always been extremely rare on the planet. They hug the coastlines of a few of the continents in the temperate region, the cooler regions. And this map, you can barely see where the green is against the continents. That's because it's hard to tell when you only have 0.2% of the landmass. Half of that has already been logged or cleared over the millennia, and only in the last few decades, probably 70 years, 80 years, in British Columbia. But of the world's temperate rainforest, 25% that remains in its original form is in British Columbia. So we hold this marvelous space very close to us, and it's rare in the world.
Well, hello there. It's good to see you. I wish I could say it's good to see you. I cannot really see you, but I know that you're there. Thank you for being here. And so one of the reasons you already heard that why we are so passionate about the Great Bear Rainforest is it's a very large area. But can you tell me just how large it is? Is it, compared to Vancouver Island, for example, half the size of Vancouver Island, same size, or twice the size? What do you think? Yeah, I heard twice the size a few times. That's correct. It's 6.4 million hectares. Vancouver Island is about 3 million hectares, and the Great Bear Rainforest is also larger than Switzerland. And it looks like a relatively small region within the context of the map of North America, but it really is the largest, mostly intact coastal temperate rainforest on the planet. And of course, as you know, part of the reason why there's so little intact old growth left is logging. There's very little intact old growth left south of the border along the west coast of North America. And in this map, you can see how much old growth got logged, converted to second growth, especially in the south of our coast, Vancouver Island.
The yellow is areas that have been logged.
Vancouver Island has about 75% of the old growth logged, and you can also see how much old growth is left in the north and central coast in the Great Bear Rainforest. And another reason why this work is so important to set aside more of the remaining old growth is the incredible carbon bank. These types of forests are among the most productive ecosystems on the planet, and there are few places on the planet where you can find forests or other ecosystems with this much carbon stored in trees and the soil.
And the Great Bear Rainforests are part of the northern forests of the world. And these forests are actually fairly young compared to tropical forests where they're millions of years old, and humans have lived within those forests for a fraction of the time that the forests have existed. Northern forests, like the Great Bear, have always had humans living within them. In fact, they established after the Ice Age and the glaciers melted. So the evolution of the forests of our coast is hand in hand with the evolution of the cultures of the peoples who lived there. It's not that there were these wild areas that humans never were in. It's exactly the opposite. Humans and the forest have always been together here. And the culture is very rich, as Eduardo was explaining, and Doug will go into much greater depth after this. But it's an area that has a number of nations. It's not just one. When we say First Nations, it's not one nation, it's many nations. And how many nations do you think that there are in the Great Bear Rainforest? This is important because it's a complex area to negotiate conservation in. And one of the reasons is that we're dealing with multiple interests. And how many First Nations do you think there are in the Great Bear Rainforest? Is it 9, 18, or 27? A, B, or C? You are right. It is C, 27 First Nations. This is like the United Nations of the coast of Canada. It's a complex place and incredibly rich cultures.
So you all know that the poster child, the species that so many people care about, not only here in BC and Canada, but across the planet, is the spirit bear, the rare white form of the black bear that only exists in this place. And what is rarer, spirit bear, the white form of the spirit bear, a panda bear, or a Sumatran tiger? What do you think? A, correct. There are.
Is this too easy?
I'm afraid it's too easy. But it's important information, and there are actually fewer than 200 truly white spirit bears. There are more black bears carrying the genetic information for the white fur. Some black bears also have the information about the white fur, and there are a few more, but only about 200 or less show up in white. And there are about 500 Sumatran tigers and 1,600 panda bears. And of course, this is only one example. Iwan mentioned a few of the other species already. There are unique coastal wolves in this region, marbled burnet, salmon, mountain goat. The list of species that depend on intact coastal temperate rainforest is very long.
So back when I started working on the Great Bear campaign with a number of other people, it was an area that was not known as the Great Bear Rainforest. At that time, the official name on the books from the province was the Central and North Coast Timber Supply Area. That's really sexy, hey? You want to save the North Coast Timber Supply Area. No. So the name the Great Bear Rainforest came as a way to actually campaign internationally about a very unique area. And at that time, it was the amount of logging was increasing. There was an onslaught, and very little of it was protected. So, how little of it was protected? Yeah, exactly, 7%. 7% is a very small amount, especially when it's very disconnected. You can't actually protect like a grizzly species that wanders across multiple valleys. Certainly not the spirit bear. Nothing was protected in the spirit bear region. So that's what sparked the scale of industrial logging sparked, as Eduardo said, the protest, both by First Nations and by environmental organizations and supporters. And that was also the time in which the market campaigns began. And there were a number of major companies who were part of the, they eventually ended up being part of the effort, but there was a lot of resistance at first, protests outside of many of their stores. But eventually, a number of really big forest product buyers, wood and paper, canceled multi-million dollars worth of contracts, and then became kind of advocates for conservation of the Great Bear Rainforest. And of these three, who can tell me which two were part of helping to use their influence to conserve areas and get the kind of social justice aspects of the Great Bear Rainforest into a real powerful conversation? Home Depot was one. Okay, somebody said Pac Bell. We had a long campaign on Pac Bell. They never changed. So it was Home Depot and Kimberly Clark were two of, and Kimberly Clark's one of the biggest paper buyers in the world. Home Depot buys 1% of all the world's lumber. These are really big companies. Pac Bell, unfortunately, decided they didn't want to ship their contract and we couldn't push them off that. But that was okay. We got some leverage anyhow.
So the protests and boycott calls were effective. The government of British Columbia and the companies active in the region acknowledged that there is a problem, that there is a threat of too much logging. And the process that took years of negotiations and planning took place. And one of the key reasons, one of the key ingredients why this process was successful was science, agreement on the science, agreement on tasking a group of experts to come up with scientific recommendations on how much do we need to set aside to protect the rainforest, to maintain ecological integrity. Group was the Coast Information Team, and they came up with the so-called ecosystem-based management handbook, which became a really key part of the Great Bear Rainforest Agreements, which were announced a little later, and I'm afraid Eduardo gave this away already, but maybe I want to hear it again.
Check if you were listening.
Let's see if you were listening. Was it back in 2004, 2006, or 2008? Correct. It was an easy one, too easy.
2006.
February 7, 2006, and this is the moment of the announcement with the First Nations, the two big groups of First Nations, and BC government, logging countries, and environmental organizations endorsing these agreements. And it was really, to a large degree, because of the leadership and resources put by the BC government to allow all parties to work on this for an extended period of time and came up with an agreement. So the key elements of the agreements are just beauty. There are four, of course: the very significant increase of protected areas network across a third of the region, over 2 million hectares, logging regulation amendment based on ecosystem-based management with the goal to meet low ecological risk, funding for thriving communities and conservation planning for First Nations communities, the $120 million coast funds, and very important, the new relationship between the BC government and First Nations, shared decision making across their territories.
So we've come a long way, and I don't want to sound like a Virginia Slims ad for cigarettes, but we've come a long way. And the reason is that there's been a tremendous amount of work put into it. We went from 7% of the Great Bear Rainforest conserved in 2005, and then by 2009, and continuing to today, 50% of the Great Bear Rainforest is off limits to logging. So this is pretty good, right? And some people can say, well, good, you've done your job, but actually, the work that we're doing is based on the best available science. And the best available science was what drove the ecosystem-based management handbook. That is, how much forest do we need to maintain in order to safeguard the health of the forest into the future, forever. And that number is 70%, or we're at 50%. So it's fabulous compared to a lot of the rest of the province. And some people might say you should focus your efforts elsewhere, but in fact we need to finish this job. We can't just leave the forests on a better than terrible condition. We need to have them in a really good condition, safe into the future. And there is a gap. So if you see this, this diagram, the pie chart, about 30% of the forest is currently protected under conservancies, so they're formally protected. The light green indicates areas that, because of the better forest management rules that have been put in place in 2009, how there's been an increase in conservation through better rules. The kind of tan-colored area is the area available for logging, and according to the best available science, that orange pie wedge, that gap, is about 500,000 hectares that should be conserved, but currently is not, in order to maintain the health of the forest. So that's the gap that we need to go from today to, over the next number of months, we need to, with First Nations, the province, and industry, we need to close that gap. And here's how we're going to do it. It is a difficult job. As Eduardo said, it's an area about the size of Switzerland. Some people compare it to Ireland. It's about the same size as Ireland. 27 First Nations, 5 major logging companies working with the Coast Forest Conservation Initiative, 3 environmental organizations. You can imagine that these negotiations are difficult. Indeed they are. They're very difficult. This isn't easy. You can't just say, we're going to protect the 70% in the north and log the hell out of the 30% of the south, or vice versa. That's not going to happen. Each nation has desires and needs within their own territory, and the ecosystems are spread out all over. So we are having very intense negotiations, discussions, computer modeling, you name it, in order to work out how to lay out the next level of conservation in a way that meets sustainable commercial forestry and the needs of the First Nations in the area. And that takes a lot of people around the table, a lot of days and a lot of hours.
And one key step in the process, historically by now, is for the environmental organizations and the group of logging companies working on this to come up with solutions that might work. Because these two groups have the history of the biggest potential for conflict and the biggest challenge to come to an agreement. So you already heard about a group of companies. Can you tell me which of these 6 are members, 5 members in this group working proactively towards increasing conservation?
C.
Louder, I don't hear. Yeah. Well, I help you a little bit with this one. So there are 5 companies who have a very long history of proactively supporting these agreements. Interfor, Western Forest Products, BC Timber Sales, House Sound Pulp and Paper and Catalyst. And the other company in this list, Timber West, is not a member of this group and actually has for a number of years opposed a further increase in conservation, and just recently got into some controversy about logging of some very critical forest areas that really should be set aside to achieve the goals of the agreement. They have recently engaged towards solving this problem, and there's a process underway. Logging is on hold in a few areas, in certain areas that are very important. And we have to take a very close look at this to see how it will unfold, but right now they are engaging to address this issue. And that's very insignificant, and that's why we have this question mark, and we hope that they will continue on this path and help to address this issue and to support a regional solution. And the other 5 companies work very hard, sometimes painfully hard, for 2 to 3 years, burning the midnight oil, coming up with a package that will actually achieve much of what we are working to achieve for so many years. So this is an attempt to summarize what is actually a very detailed proposal, but these recommendations will actually achieve the goal to set aside 70% of the natural old-growth forest. There will be sustainable timber supply for forestry operations in the right places. We would also, in the long term, map the managed forest that will and can get logged and the natural forest which will be set aside, and at the end of the day cover up to 85% of the region's forest. There will be restoration reserves in some areas that got hard hit by logging in the past, where some second growth forest needs to be restored to old growth conditions, and there will be a number of new protection areas. And these recommendations are currently under revision by the provincial government and First Nations. We hope that this process can be wrapped up this year, and that we will be able to see all the agreements and the proposals for logging regulation wrapped up by end of the year. And this is incredibly important, because this photo shows an example of logging in the recent past without doing the important work of figuring out how to set aside enough forest for species and for wildlife, for clean air, clean water, and many other environmental services. This is an extreme example. It happened in the southern portion of the Great Barrier Rainforest. And this is also showing why we have to speed up this work, because we are losing critical forest that should be set aside to meet the conservation goals the longer we take to finalize this process. And it will take longer to recover if we cannot finish this job very, very soon. Another reason is climate change. Old growth forest and older forest is more resilient to climate change, to impacts. And we will see in some cases other types of forest growing back after logging. So we want to protect as much as possible of the remaining old growth to make sure that these forests can continue into the future and that our kids and grandchildren will see them into the future. And of course, people around the world care about this place, and this is just one example from a protest in Berlin a year ago. There are also many people in poorer nations, in tropical rainforest countries, who are looking at us in the richer parts of the world, expecting that we will follow through on our responsibility and protect our natural forest to help fight climate change and inspire hope and change. So fortunately, there's still a lot of beautiful forests to protect, and thanks for sharing this presentation with us.